Church, over and over again, I've come to see that Lent does this gentle but very honest thing to us. Lent allows us space to slow down enough to ask some questions that we usually don't make time for in our lives. Not just the sort of, what do I believe questions, but questions like, what am I doing with my life? What am I carrying? What am I clinging to? And what has God placed in my hands? Because if you pay attention, Lent doesn't just call us to feel sorry for our sin. Lent calls us to practice our way back into freedom. That's why we fast during this season, so that we can create space for God to meet us in our lives. That's why we add spiritual disciplines for this season, so that we can allow God to help us practice our way back into the freedom that He offers us. Spiritual disciplines are called practices for a reason. They help us when we leave the prayer closet, when we leave Bible study, to be able to love well out in the world. Lent, friends, confronts us with our mortality and allows us to think about how we might use our gifts, our skills, our energy, our resources, our influence, not just for our gain, but for the sake of God's kingdom. Not because God's trying to take something from us, but because God is trying to give something through us. And I think that's a critical thing for us to understand. That when it comes to what God is asking of us, it has less to do with God taking and more with what God would have us do with the rich blessings He's poured out upon us. That's why we've grounded this Lenten series around the advice that John Wesley gives us. He says this: do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. Do all the good. Do all the good. Stephanie brought us into this series last week, and this week we're talking about doing all the good we can by all the means we can. Now, it's easy to jump into thinking this is a sermon about financial stewardship. And certainly financial stewardship is a small piece of it. But I think what Wesley is getting at, and what Jesus is inviting us to consider, is how we might leverage our whole lives for the sake of Him and for the sake of God's kingdom. How we can do all the good we can by all the means that we can. That phrase is radical, but it's also simple. Wesley is basically saying to us, God has placed things in your life, resources, relationships, abilities, opportunities, not just for your comfort, not just for our sake, but for God's purposes growing in the world. But the truth is, a lot of us, we want to do good, but we feel stuck. We want to help, but we're busy. We want to make a difference, but we feel like what we have it's just not enough to make a difference. We want to be generous, but we're also afraid. So today, we're going to talk about what it looks like to live faithfully with God and with what God has placed in our hands to do all the good that we can by all the means that we can. And Jesus gives us this wonderful parable about doing just that. Jesus says that a master is going away, but before he leaves, he calls his 3 servants in and he trusts them with his property. To one, he gives 5 bags or 5 talents. That's a year's worth of wage. To another, he gives 2 talents or 2 bags of gold. To another, he just gives 1. Now, when we hear talent, we think about ability a lot of times. We think about singing, teaching, leadership. But in Jesus' day, again, a talent was a large sum of money, which means that this story is about more than skills. It's about stewardship. What we do, what you and I do with what we've been entrusted with. And right away, Jesus makes this point: none of it belongs to the servants. Think about that. The three servants are called in, and the master gives his money. He gives the 5 bags, the 2 bags, the 1 bag. It's his money. It all belongs to the master. These servants are not owners, they're just stewards. All that they have is a gift. And friends, the same is true for you and I. Your time, your mind, your money, your relationships, your influence, your story, your opportunities, they're all given to you by God, and you are to steward them well. To steward them for the sake of God's name and for the sake of God's kingdom. Because all that you have has simply been entrusted to you for a season. I find it interesting that Jesus cares so much about how his disciples and people handled money and not resources. How they handled money and resources. Not because Jesus was obsessed with budgets. In fact, if you really look over Jesus' ministry, you find that he's not really looking in on Judas and what Judas is doing with the bag of gold, right? He's not paying that much attention. But he often speaks of money because he's concerned about what we do with the tools that we have. Because Jesus believes that money is one of the most revealing spiritual tools in our lives. Money shows us what we trust. Money shows us what we fear. Money shows us what we love. So Jesus tells the story, and then something important happens. The first 2 servants, when they receive those bags of gold, they get to work. They take action. What's entrusted to them, it grows. But the 3rd servant, he digs a hole. He digs a hole in the ground, and he buries the money. I just think about mayonnaise jars, right? Stuffing that money in there, burying that mayonnaise jar in the ground. He buries the money. Not because he's lazy, but because the 3rd servant was afraid. In fact, he says it. He says, I was afraid. I was afraid. That's the danger that Jesus is naming. Most often, we don't squander what God gives us. We don't spend all that we have in wild living like the prodigal son does. We don't often squander the gifts that God gives us. Instead, we hide them because we are afraid. We're afraid of what might happen. Or we start comparing what we have to what others have. And I'm going to be honest with you, friends. The 2 quiet killers of faithfulness in our lives are fear and comparison. You can look at that in any area of your life. Fear and comparison will keep you from faithfulness. So let's talk about fear first. Because fear is sneaky. Because oftentimes fear, it looks like responsibility. Fear says, I'm just being careful. I'm going to put this money in that mayonnaise jar and bury it in the yard where it'll be safe. Nothing will happen to it. I'm just trying to be careful. Or I'm just waiting for the right time. Fear says, I'm just trying not to mess this up. But friends, fear has a deep spiritual cost to us because fear keeps us from obedience. Fear keeps us living love that is theoretical instead of real. Fear keeps us buried and our giftedness buried. And fear shows up in our lives in a lot of different ways. We say things like, if I give, I'm not sure that I'll have enough. If I serve, I'm probably just going to burn out, or I'm not going to be any good at whatever it is that I might be doing. If I step out, I'll fail. Now, I actually love that one because I believe that failure means that you tried something, you risked something, and you learned something, right? When we fail in the church, when we fail in our lives, you know what we should do? Throw a pizza party, right? Like we should get balloons and streamers and confetti. Like we should do the thing whenever we fail, because if we fail, that means we tried something and it didn't work. Friends, just a couple of weeks ago here at the church, we tried something and we failed. Like we tried to start a program and it did not work. In fact, most of you are like, what is he talking about? That's how bad we failed. Okay? Right? It didn't work. It was a great idea. We took a risk. We failed. And we learned. We learned. We stretched ourselves. And we're going to come back at that very same idea from a different angle. And perhaps the next opportunity we have to sow and leverage, God will bless and multiply it. If we don't fail, we don't risk. So don't be afraid of stepping out and failing. It happens to all of us. Sometimes fear says this: if I get involved, someone is going to criticize me in the way that I do things, or if I commit, I'll get stuck. But what we end up doing is burying what God has entrusted to us instead of using what God has blessed us with. Instead of leveraging all that we have for the kingdom, we tuck it away because we're afraid, and it goes to places where it can't be used, it can't be risked, it can't be lost. But here's the thing: if our gifts and talents and skills and abilities and gifts and resources are buried, they cannot be multiplied. They cannot be multiplied. So we cannot let fear keep us from stepping out in faith. We cannot let fear keep us from doing all the good we can. Because we're called to do all the good we can by all the means we can. Fear is the first killer of faithfulness. And the second is like it: comparison. In Jesus' story, not everybody gets the same amount of money, right? The one servant gets the 5 bags or the 5 talents, the other gets 2, and the third gets 1. The interesting thing is, he praises the one who has 2 the same way that he praises the one who has 5. That's incredible news for you and I, because God isn't asking why we don't have what somebody else has when it comes to resources. God's asking, what are you doing with what I've placed in your hands? What are you doing with what I've given you and blessed you with? Financially, relationally, with your skills, talents, and abilities, what are you doing with it? You know, there's this other episode in Jesus' life and ministry where there are 5,000 people who are gathered to hear Jesus speak. And Jesus looks out over the crowd and he sees that they are hungry. And he asks the disciples, "What do you have?" And they say, "We don't have anything, Jesus. And these people are hungry and we can't feed them." But then a young boy shows up with his sack lunch. You remember that? Right? He's got the loaves and the fish. Now, he could have taken that sack lunch and hidden it away because, you know, I gotta have my lunch. My lunch can't feed everybody, right? He could have hidden it away or pushed it aside, but instead he does something incredible. He says, "Listen, all I have are these small loaves and these fish here." And he puts them into the hands of Jesus. And Jesus takes his limited gifts, his limited resources, his limited opportunities, and Jesus multiplies them into an abundance. Into an abundance, enough that there's more than enough. Friends, God's not asking you to do or be what someone else is, but instead, what are you doing with what you have? So don't say, "I don't have that much time," or "I'm not as gifted as that person is," or "I can't live like those folks. My influence isn't like theirs." That kind of comparison will always shrink your life. It will convince you that the little you have doesn't matter at all. But small acts of good, done consistently, done faithfully, bring real life and real world transformation. Faithfulness is not about how much you start with. It's about what love does with what you have. You know, just the other day I was in Lowe's and I walked past the seed display, and I was instantly transported back to the feed and seed on Highway 17 at Ageechee Farms down in Savannah. And I could smell that place. It's like chemical and dirt is what it smelled like. And I remember being in there with my grandfather, and my grandfather, he had a garden, about an acre garden in his backyard, and he would let us get, you know, little seed packets from time to time, and we get to plant those seeds. And that got me to thinking about this message. because I picked up one of those packets of seeds and I shook it and remembered, oh yeah, that is what mustard seeds sound like. But seed, it only has two futures. You know that, right? Seed only has two futures. You can store it or you can sow it. If you take those seeds, mustard seeds, cucumber seeds, sweet pepper seeds, whatever kind of seeds you have, and you hold on to the packet, you'll have that packet. But if you were to sow those seeds into the ground, what you'll have is a harvest. You'll have an abundance. Seed only has two futures. You can store it or you can sow it. Stored seed, feels safe. It feels clean. It stays controlled, but it never becomes anything. Sown seed looks risky because you plant it in the ground and you can't control everything. You can't control the weather, the timing, the conditions, but sowing seed is the only path to harvest. And that's exactly what Paul is talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, the one who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. The one who sows generously will reap generously. Do all the good you can by all the means you can. And then Paul tells us something that matters deeply. It's God who supplies the seed to the sower. Meaning God doesn't just ask for generosity from you. God provides you the means by which to practice it. God isn't trying to drain you. God is trying to form you. And Paul says you'll be enriched in every way for your great generosity. Not enriched so that you can stockpile and hoard away, but enriched so that you can keep on sowing, so that you can keep on planting seeds of faith and hope and love and grace into the world. Seed multiplies only when it's sown. Our skills, our gifts, our talents and abilities, they're only multiplied when we put them to work for God's kingdom. So what does that look like in your life? What does doing all the good you can by all the means you can look like? We're going to make it real practical for just a second. Because what we believe about God must impact the way that we live our lives, the way that we love our neighbors, the way that we care for the people that we see in the world around us. Do all the good you can by all the means you can means that we take inventory of what God has placed in our hands. How can I love others with this? How can I bless God with this? Not someday, but right here and right now. Today, friends, you can do all the good you can by all the means you can by giving your time. Put love on the calendar. Some of you don't need more motivation to be generous and to bless others. You just need a plan. Love doesn't happen because we care. Love happens when we choose it. So make that phone call today. Go visit that person. Send that note. Make that meal. Carry it over. Take that ride. Sit and listen without rushing to the next thing. And yes, sometimes it's even as simple as deciding I'm going to show up and be present today. Doing good by leveraging your time. You can do good by your talents, putting your gifts into circulation. There are people in this church and in this community of faith who need to know how to do what you do, who need to know what you know. There are people who need the gifts and talents that God has entrusted to you. Some of you are builders, some of you are organizers, some of you are encouragers, some of you are teachers, some of you have wisdom and patience. And Lord knows we need more wisdom and patience in our world today, don't we? Some of you have it, and you can teach us to be more patient, to live according to wisdom and the movement of God. And you might not think that your skills and your gifts, your talents are spiritual, but I'll tell you that spiritual is using the gifts, using those gifts so that someone else is cared for. That is holy work, friends. Then there's your treasure. You can practice kind-hearted generosity. Generosity, friends, it's not about fundraising, it's about formation. It's a way of saying, Jesus, you are my security. And here's what I've learned as a pastor. People aren't usually resistant to generosity because they're selfish. We're resistant to generosity because we're scared. Because the world says we need to be worried about inflation and retirement and medical bills and college and the unknown. The world says you should be afraid. So stockpile what you have. Paul says God loves a cheerful giver. Not a pressured giver, not a shamed giver, but a cheerful one. And so we can give generously and faithfully because we know that God will provide for our every need in seasons of plenty and in seasons of want. God's provision is with us. So we can let go of that which we've clinged so tightly to for the sake of others and for the sake of God's kingdom. What about your relationships? You can use your influence for someone else's good. Invite someone in then. Invite two people who should know each other. Advocate for someone who doesn't have a voice. Notice the person that everyone else seems to overlook. That's your means. Your relationships aren't just for your comfort. They're one of the ways that God moves love through the world. Friends, we want to be a church that's building a foundation not only for the present but for the future. That means that we must do all the good we can by all the means we can. We must leverage our gifts and our graces, not so that we build another building, because Lord knows we don't need another building. Y'all just put that, we're not doing that, okay? We want to build a foundation that allows us to leverage all of our giftedness in the diversity of its forms for the sake of God's kingdom, so that our city, so that our county, so that our world can know that Jesus is alive and that the Spirit is moving. Friends, we have an opportunity to do all the good we can by all the means we can. We get to do this. We get to see God's kingdom move with power through our simple and small acts of faithfulness, moment by moment and day by day. So may we do all the good we can by all the means we can, that the world might receive the blessing of God.